Hi, friends. It is Natasha of Polite Creations joining you today on the Hero Arts blog with a video sharing two cards that I created using the September Hero Studio Layering Stencil of the month. This month's layering stencil is the Fairy Tale Forest. It creates a beautiful forest with different trees. So I am jumping right in with the first layer. I'm using white cardstock that I've already cut down to A2 just so I can kind of make sure I'm getting the areas I want on my panel. However, you can just use a larger panel and your registration marks will ink right onto that panel and you can cut it down. But again, I am just using an A2 panel and I've grabbed some low-tack tape and put that around the corners to create a makeshift guide for where my stencils will lay, since again I am using a smaller A2 panel. For my first layer, I'm going in with cream sickle ink. This is the Hero Hues reactive ink, and I'm putting that on my blending brush. I'm using a smaller blending brush, and I am kind of stippling that into the stencil instead of doing the normal circular motions to fill the stencil. I want to create some texture, so by stippling this, I am creating almost the look of an actual tree, and how it is not all one color. It is a gradient of the colors and the leaves, and there are gaps. So I'm going to stipple in the creamsicle, and then I'm going to move on and do the same thing with some pumpkin ink, which is darker. I want to again create gradient and texture, so I'm using various inks in the same color families for each stencil. I'm just rolling my brush in the ink as well to make sure that it kind of keeps its shape. I am sure seeing so much white space in the stencil may make some of you nervous, but I promise the final result pays off and it is a beautiful effect for your stencil, especially of something like this with trees and having texture. Once I've finished with the pumpkin, I move on and add a little bit of papaya. I wanted to break up the color even more and have more variation of this orange tone. So I go back in with papaya and add that into the mix. My main goal with the stippling throughout the entire process is just trying to make sure that the outer shape or the outer edge of these trees is formed and that there is a variation of those colors. Moving on to my second layer, I had to make sure that I had it on the right side, so you will see me flip it at the beginning because I kept mixing them up and not paying attention. So do better than I did and make sure you are paying attention to the bottom of your stencils and where that Hero Arts branding is at the bottom, as well as where the number is on the bottom of each stencil, so everything aligns. There is some minimal overlap. There is a bit of overlap, but it is not completely covering a tree. So if you see that occurring, check to make sure that your stencil is on the right side. For this second layer, I am going in with blue raspberry reactive ink. I will say that I enjoy doing this method more with my reactive inks, and I think that's partially because of how smoothly they go on in comparison to my core inks. I did have to ink my brushes a little bit more when I was using those core inks, but it could also be that my ink pads are a little dry and need to be refilled. So, in general, use a juicy ink pad if you can when doing this, and you will get better results, in my opinion. Once I have the blue raspberry in place, I go in with Egyptian blue, and this glitz ink also adds a little bit of sparkle. So, it is a subtle way to add in some sparkle to your projects if you like. For this second layer, I was trying to go from dark to light and focus on the centers of the trees because that is where the tree trunks and branches will lay with the final stencil. So keep that in mind if you want to have a little bit more of a realistic look, keeping things darker and shadowed behind the tree trunk when you are stippling in your color. For my third layer in the final tree color, I'm going in with Berry Smoothie. This color did appear a bit pink, more pink than I would have liked. So I end up going back in with Raspberry Jam to add more depth to these trees. The goal for this again was to create texture and add depth without having to use a bunch of different types of supplies. I'm solely relying on my inks to get the job done to create these beautiful cards. I wanted to bring out more of the reds and purples with this last layer of trees. So again, I am going to end up grabbing raspberry jam and working that into these trees, providing more depth. Once this layer is complete, I do move on to using the root beer reactive ink, and I'm just blending that in all over in the normal circular motion across the stencil. I did not want to add any differentiation of color or any additional depth. I wanted that to kind of stand on its own and let the leaves be the star of the show. So again, I am just going in with that root beer and regularly stenciling that layer on. Once that is complete, this is how my panel is looking. Here is a little better look at how the trees and the faux leaves and variation turn out. I set that panel to the side to dry, and then I grab another A2 panel of white cardstock, and I am swiping that raspberry jam on one edge, about an inch and a half or so of space. I'm just swiping and trying to create a solid band of color. I'm then going to rotate that and use the pumpkin to do the same to the other end. I let this dry for a few minutes, and then I grab my paper trimmer and I'm going to begin to cut this panel as well as our stencil panel down. I'm going to create two cards out of this one little A2 panel that we stenciled, and I'm going to use these bands of color as accents. I cut two half-inch strips of each of those color bands, and then I grabbed my A2 panel and created two 2-inch panels from my A2 panel. So I'm left with four color strips and two stenciled strips for my card front. I am grabbing one of each of those color strips and layering them on one another. I am eyeballing this, but I wanted to create about a quarter of an inch strip of color to be the band against the layered panel and break up the color when I mat this onto a white A2 panel. If you are not good with the eyeballing and want to be more precise, feel free to do so, but I just chose to eyeball it. I did like the pumpkin against the layered stenciled panel more than I did the raspberry jam next to it, so I do end up switching out that second strip that I created and placing the pumpkin next to uh, the trees. I also used a white paint pen to clean up some of the areas where my stenciling got a little messy or there was a slight smudge. So that is a quick little tip. If you need to clean up an area, use a paint pen of the same color as the background to clean things up. Acrylic paint pens work best because they will cover up the color on the page completely. Once I'd glued my panels onto an A2 panel of white, I moved on to adding a sentiment, and I am using the sentiment that comes with the Stampin' Cut for the month of September, and I'm just using some intensified black ink to stamp that into place. And my cards are essentially done. Here is what they look like. I also went in and created a second set of cards, and I chose to cut my panel diagonally but still do the same thing with using the strips of color to break up the design from the white panel. And then I added a sentiment, and those sentiments come from the card kit of the month. Final finishing touches, we're going back in and adding a couple gems just to add a little bit more sparkle. But yeah, guys, this is my completed set of cards. I hope you found some inspiration for how you can use the layering stencil and ways to add texture to your cards. Again, I am Natasha of Polite Creations. Thank you so much for joining me on the Hero Arts blog, and have a great day.